It's not like you're gonna shoot me.
Why do people keep saying that?
Well, hey, guess what? It's been 10 years since.
Maybe you're not quite as dauntless as you thought you were.
You're right. I'm not. I'm Divergent.
The 2000s and 2010s were kind of hilarious for the sheer number of films that shamelessly tried to ape a very specific trend to try and capitalize on whatever the cool kids were watching, whereas the 90s had your standard teen rom-coms, albeit some very particular ones that were high school versions of classic literature. The early 2000s gave us adaptations of children's fantasy books to milk the success of Harry Potter, the late 2000s gave us paranormal romances to imitate Twilight, and the early 2010s gave us dystopian sci-fi courtesy of the Hunger Games. And I don't want this to sound cynical, because I was here for the first and third for absolute certain. Because of the first, we got the best adaptation of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and many others I talked about 3 years ago, and I really loved The Hunger Games when it came out, despite having no knowledge of the books. I also quite enjoyed The Maze Runner, which everyone calls The Hunger Games for boys as if that was a strike against either. And I don't know if anyone remembers this, but YouTubers at the time acted like this was a sign of the apocalypse. Bitter Gen Xers were complaining into their cameras about what millennials were watching, and it felt like it was being condemned as the end of cinema as we know it. Book adaptations are looking kind of refreshing by today's standards, huh?
That is mahogany!
I am not going to claim that these films were highbrow or secretly deep and profound or anything beyond what they were presented as. They were my trash, I loved them, and I still do. The Hunger Games is the objectively best film and franchise overall, with all four being of a consistently good quality, despite lukewarm reactions to Mockingjay being split into two parts. The Maze Runner had a well-received first film, a god-awful second film, and a respectable third, ending the series on a good note. But there was one other series that was caught up in the adaptation trend, and proved successful enough to get its remaining books adapted. Sort of.
They call it Divergent.
Divergent was written by Veronica Roth and published while she was still in her senior year at Northwestern University, and she'd already sold the film rights before she even graduated. She knew from the beginning that she wanted to write commercial YA fiction, in a time when writing genre stories was still looked down on, with her professors saying that writing fantasy would be easy and like a vacation compared to real writing, and her classmates asked if she was just writing to pay bills. It was indeed compared to The Hunger Games, which had been published 4 years previously, and its film adaptation was already on the way, but more so as a companion piece than outright rip-off. While the premise got some criticism, with Kirkus reviews calling it preposterous, and book lists saying it stretches credibility, the book was an instant success and received pretty well by critics too, with the worst thing people could say was that it was a little derivative. And two more, Insurgent and Allegiant, were published in quick succession. Its popularity also spelled out good things for the film adaptation, which was released in an uncertain market. Since although The Hunger Games had been a smash hit, every other YA adaptation not called Twilight had flopped. But Divergent was initially given a budget of $40 million that was then increased to $85 after the aforementioned success of The Hunger Games. And its advance ticket sales were so strong that a sequel was greenlit before director Neil Berger had even finished post-production on the first, leading to him dropping out of Insurgent, which is probably definitely where the adaptation started to go wrong. Still though, Insurgent was another financial success, despite being considered a lesser adaptation. The third book followed the trend of Harry Potter, Twilight and The Hunger Games having their finale split into two, with the fourth to be titled Ascendant. Disaster struck, however, when the Allegiant film bombed at the box office and was trashed by critics, eventually leading to Ascendant being demoted to a potential television movie and pilot for a spin-off series that never materialized.
From what I know, they want to proceed with a television show, which is not something that I signed up to do.
The franchise still continued in literary form, however, with Veronica Roth later releasing a prequel from Thor's perspective, made up of a set of segments written back when she was planning to make him the POV character. A short story serving as an epilogue set 3 years later after the end of Allegiant was later released in 2018. As I said earlier, the very existence of this franchise heralded the end of cinema, according to some YouTubers. I can't remember the specific review, but one opened with a dude declaring that he would rather watch all 5 Twilight movies than sit through a minute of Divergent. And so it was the thing everyone broadcast their hate for.
Lives smack in between Harry Potter and The Hunger Games. It's like they had a baby.
This stink even extended to me, because I remember seeing a quick TV spot and just scoffing at a Hunger Games ripoff. but I eventually checked it out to see what was so terrible, and guys, I want to maintain some credibility and say my reaction was, yeah, it's fine. But while Candor may not be my preferred faction, I won't lie or understate how obsessed I became with this franchise.
I think you might be overestimating my character.
Shailene Woodley was my new favourite actress for about a year, and I watched everything she'd been in, including The Descendants, The Spectacular Now, and yes, The Fault in Our Stars, and I made the mistake of watching this scene on a very crowded bus trip, and the poor old dear sat next to me got all the waterworks. I'd started considering acting at the time, but hadn't yet taken the plunge and naively hoped I'd get to be in the spin-off TV series. Over the years, I've wondered whether it was just what I needed at that moment in time, and I'd tentatively revisit it to have a new perspective, even worrying that I wouldn't be able to enjoy it like I used to. But considering the spoilerific title I went with, we can conclude that the answer was a resounding no.
There's a certain beauty in your resistance.
So let's go. Divergent takes place in a dystopian Chicago, and any friends from there I've made in the last few years usually have to suffer from one or two jokes about it. There, the people are divided into 5 factions: the intelligence-based erudite, the pacifist farmers Amity, the lawfully honest Candor, the brave military Dauntless, and the selfless government Abnegation. And there's also the factionless outcasts who live on the fringes of society. Fun fact, if you take the first letter of each faction and include factionless, then it spells out facade, and foreshadows the plot twists of the following books. At 16, everyone takes a test to determine which faction they're best suited to, and they then choose if they want to remain in the faction of their birth or join a new one.
The test should tell us what to do.
You're still free to choose.
Yeah, this draws heavy inspiration from the Hogwarts house system in the Harry Potter books, where the students are sorted into groups as soon as they start school based on personality type, and Ravenclaw, if you're curious. There have been endless criticisms about the idea of dividing 11-year-olds up based on their core values as decided by a mind-reading hat, so Divergent took that idea and ran with it, by creating a society where people are divided that same way for life at an older age, not just as a metaphor for how we're pressured to conform to cliques as teenagers, but also for society's repeated obsession with categorization. The premise is very much a make-it-or-break-it deal for readers. Again, like the Hunger Games, if you can't accept that society has devolved into the whole world accepting that they just have to sacrifice 24 teenagers for a televised fight to the death, then the book closes forever. Same for a world where humanity now makes 16-year-olds choose their faction.
I want you to choose who you truly are and where you truly belong.
I'll be playing the autism card and stating that Triss discovering she has a different mind than the people around her, having to learn to pass when she's aware of it, even having to pick and choose what she's allowed to be shown excelling at, and clicking with someone who has the same deal is extremely relatable. And yes, the movie has a few very heavy-handed lines of dialogue, but not enough to ruin it for me.
You don't fit into a category, they can't control you.
If people can complain about Barbie not getting a Best Director Oscar when it has scenes like this, I can enjoy Divergent while still looking at its flaws critically.
You think that human nature is a weakness?
And let's go there with the Hunger Games comparisons. I love both, and I think they actually make a nice pair of companion pieces, the same way Charmed is to Buffy. Both were supernatural drama shows on the same network with strong themes of female empowerment, but Buffy was more teen-oriented, and Charmed in turn more adult. Both Divergent and The Hunger Games had present tense style narrations from the perspective of a young woman, and involved the fracturing of society. Speaking from the Divergent point, The Hunger Games would be told from the point of view of the factionless, where Katniss Everdeen is from the poorest district and already aware that she's being screwed over by the government, with her motivation being simply trying to survive and make the best of the raw hand the world has dealt her. Divergent, meanwhile, is told from the point of view of the capital, or at least from people who believe they're part of it. They're given the opportunity to choose what faction they can be part of, giving the illusion of choice, and presenting the dystopia as something that's best for society as a whole.
The future belongs to those who know where they belong.
Triss comes from a privileged background of having two parents very prominent in the government, and her love interest is the son of Abnegation's leader, with her arc in the first book and film including her slowly realizing the flaws in the system as the society crumbles around her. And while there are similar setups, The Hunger Games goes for a more sociologically driven storytelling, while Divergent is psychological. The Hunger Games is about the society, with Katniss being the reader or audience surrogate for us to experience it through. And while she has character development, it is not crucial to the plot beats. The big climax of Catching Fire, the second movie, is an action set piece that affects the world itself. And while Katniss's characterization is focused on, the primary concern is what's happening in the districts.
This is the revolution, and you are the Mockingjay.
Divergent, meanwhile, is focused on personal identity, with the climax of its second movie, one of the strongest aspects of an inferior follow-up, being about Triss forgiving herself and coming to a personal acceptance, with the bringing down of the corrupt system being secondary to her inner journey.
No one will ever forgive you for what you've done. You're wrong.
It's different, not better or worse, though Catching Fire is of course a far stronger film than Insurgent.
Thanks. Let's do it again sometime.
Thank you.
The film adaptation recognises what makes both properties different, and I think Neil Burger's direction often goes very ignored in terms of the choices he made in bringing it to the screen, especially in comparison to some of the other adaptations that failed.
I don't even know who I'm talking to. You're a killer. A cold-blooded killer.
As opposed to a peace-loving killer.
I know what I saw.
Take The Mortal Instruments, which came out right before Divergent, and it too was based on a book heavily influenced by Harry Potter, but while the book was light-hearted and quippy, the film is dour and serious in a clear attempt to ape Twilight, right down to casting Lily Collins as Clary, who is described as a redhead with curly hair in the book and is made to resemble Bella Swan in the film. Shadowhunters had its problems, but Catherine McNamara was not one of them. Where the City of Bones film was so derivative of a dying trend, Neil Burger deliberately tried to make sure Divergent was visually distinct from The Hunger Games. The latter had a rural setting with a very stripped-back indie aesthetic, and even the scenes in the capital still have a very stark look to them. Neil Burger emphasised Divergent's urban setting, with plenty of scenes bathed in neon and extremely dominant colours, with even these sequences underground being lit with a turquoise hue that I just love. The aim was to show Chicago as a communal utopia that would slowly reveal the corruption underneath, with the starkness coming out in the final act.
Everything's fine, there's nothing to worry about.
Seriously, I just love the way this movie is shot. Neil Burger clearly had a vision for it, and the Insurgent film definitely lost it with the switch in directors. While the Catching Fire film looked a lot glossier with its increased budget compared to the first, but was still consistent, Insurgent looks more like generic sci-fi, and the Allegiant film at least looks nicer. Yes, there are pacing issues, especially towards the end, but this is a really well-directed book-to-film adaptation overall, with plenty of care and thought put into every choice. It knew when to deviate from the source material and still capture the spirit of what was going on. And rather than trying to fit a square peg into a round hole like so many of the others that flopped, it knew how to stand alongside the other entries it was greenlit to emulate and distinguish itself.
Even if my parents would take me back, I wouldn't belong there anymore.
It can be enjoyed alongside The Hunger Games and The Maze Runner, and there are some areas in which I prefer it to them.
My name's Triss.
First jumper, Triss!
I already devoted a section to Triss in a video I made on underrated heroines a couple of years back, so I will try not to repeat myself, but I cannot guarantee success.
Of course.
I will say that these YA dystopias never ran into the same problem as the kids' fantasy or paranormal romances, where the leads had to spend the subsequent years proving they could act, actually. We all knew J-Law was fantastic, although some were in denial about Josh Hutcherson, clearly having never watched Bridge to Terabithia. Dylan O'Brien? My f***ing god, what a performance. And Shailene Woodley was the same.
If you ever come close to me again, I will kill you. You need to stay away from me.
She's an actress who I gravitated towards instantly, and took a lot of notes from for how refreshing her craft was compared to the industry's obsession with method acting and all these techniques, where she said, "For me, it's all about learning my lines, showing up on time and professionally listening to what others are saying, and then truthfully and authentically reacting off their expressions." She's another one who got into acting very young, and spent her childhood in commercials and various minor roles on all the TV shows of the day, first getting noticed for the ABC Family series The Secret Life of the American Teenager, but properly hitting it big when she was cast in The Descendants, getting to play the troubled daughter of George Clooney, who reveals that her comatose mother had been having an affair.
Dad, Mom was cheating on you.
Although this made her a critical darling and got a lot of positive attention, she had no particular interest in movie stardom, and became quite notorious for how selective she was with certain scripts. She turned down the 2013 remake of Carrie, Tomorrowland, and 50 Shades of Grey, but that didn't mean she was averse to commercial films, as she was cast as Mary Jane Watson in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, later saying that the script was one of the best she'd ever read.
It is one of the best scripts I have ever read, and that's not a lie. I mean,
her scenes were cut, and the franchise's cancellation meant that her MJ would never see the light of day, and she spent a while considering dropping out of acting because of the lack of good scripts coming her way, but luckily an adaptation of a teen coming-of-age book called The Spectacular Now came along, and this paired her with Miles Teller, who she would later convince to sign on to Divergent by saying he'd get to punch her in the face. And comparing The Descendants, The Spectacular Now, and Divergent alongside each other, you can see the range. Alex King is a combative drinker who has to grapple with her extremely complicated relationship towards her dying mother. Amy Finnicky is a shy sci-fi nerd who doesn't believe she's beautiful, falls in love with a frat boy, and has to be taught how to curse in one of the most magnificent scenes she's ever performed.
Get off my motherfucking back, Mom!
Yes!
God!
God!
Yeah!
And then there's Hazel Grace, who is the let's show I can act type of role, but again, very distinct from the previous two.
This is your life, okay? This is all you get. You get me, and you get your family, and you get this world, and that's it.
Yes, this was mainly an excuse to gush about Shailene Woodley's filmography, but Divergent was of course caught in the middle. The first two are indie dramas where you can be understated, whereas Divergent is more obviously commercial and requires that movie star charisma, while also needing those actory scenes, since it is a book adaptation. And sweet Jesus, is Shailene Woodley just so good in this role. Triss is an introverted character and has to be subdued in a lot of scenes, but she is never boring or flat on screen, and brings everything that's needed.
What about my parents?
You can tell she cared very much about contributing to a good adaptation, and she even got so into reading the books and immersing herself in the world that at one point, Neil Berger recalls her asking why they weren't adapting a certain crucial scene and not realizing it was from the second book. She becomes Triss just as completely as J-Law becomes Katniss, Dylan O'Brien becomes Thomas, Daniel Radcliffe becomes Harry, Georgie Henley becomes Lucy. You get my gushing? And even outside of a great performance bringing her to life, Triss is a breath of fresh air compared to the female characters of then and even now. Her and Katniss were kind of an anomaly between the likes of Bella Swan and Hermione Granger, who seemed to represent two extremes. Bella was lambasted for being useless and needing to be rescued, while Hermione often received criticism for being too good at everything, especially with how the movies tended to file off the times she messed up or was in the wrong, although the Order of the Phoenix movie did do a lot of damage control. What made Triss stand out to me is that she begins the story in the Selfless faction, and although she longs to be part of the Brave one and that's why she joins it, she is realistically quite terrible at combat once she starts. She's actually at the bottom of the scoreboard.
I'm the weakest one here. Then you'll be most improved.
Triss then realizes that in order to prove herself, she has to buckle down and do extra training, actually working for her success. And she's not suddenly brilliant after one training montage. She gets better, sure, but she still loses her fight against Peter and nearly gets cut. But in one of my favourite moments, she runs towards that train and earns her spot as part of the Capture the Flag mission.
Who let you out?
I did.
She's not automatically smart like Hermione, or automatically brilliant at everything like whatever generic strong female lead from 2017 onward. And even the brilliance she comes by naturally from being Divergent isn't exclusive to her, since 4 is a Divergent as well. Once she's worked for her success, it makes all the cool things she does mean that much more, because we had a front row seat to her journey. The Who Let You Out scene wouldn't resonate half as much with me if it hadn't been preceded by her lowest moments.
Have you seen the scoreboard? Where am I? You're below the line.
Triss is a fantastic character and deserves to be remembered as such. And you know what else is quite fantastic about this movie in particular and doesn't get talked about? Since these book adaptations were all over the media at the time, a hot talking point was whether the romances were cause for concern, since it was impressionable young minds reading and watching them.
How did you get in here?
The window?
Twilight is the big comparison point here, since although some of the backlash was simply hate of something so obviously for girls, a big issue was the fact that all 3 prongs in the love triangle were kind of horrible people. Obviously Edward is the first one we think of, what with his watching Bella while she sleeps, damaging her car to prevent her from seeing Jacob, nearly killing himself because he thought she was dead, and all sorts of other controlling behaviours that Bella rationalizes by saying he's just doing them because he loves her. Jacob then tries to sabotage her relationship with Edward and emotionally blackmails her into kissing him, as well as delighting in torturing Edward during the sequence in the cuck tent, and then his biggest crime of nicknaming his next choice after the Loch Ness Monster.
Nessie? You nicknamed my daughter after the Loch Ness Monster?
And even Bella has received criticism for possibly profiling as a sociopath, but we don't have time to go into that. Even outside of Twilight, there were endless debates over the healthiness of the Ron-Hermione pairing, since Ron uses Lavender Brown to get back at Hermione when he finds out she kissed Victor Crumb 2 years ago, and Hermione in turn gets revenge by conjuring up birds that attack him, both of which are thankfully toned down in the film. And in Divergent, I was really struck by how the romance was one of the healthiest I've seen in one of these YA adaptations, and reading the prequel from Four's perspective definitely enhances the experience, since he was pretty much in the same situation as her, an abnegation transfer from a prominent family who had to reinvent himself while also concealing that he's a Divergent. But where he differs from Triss is that she had a loving family, whereas his mother ran away when she was younger, and left him with his abusive father. So as a result, he is believably closed off and aloof to everyone at first. But then he sees Triss trying, and, realizing there's similarities, tries to help her improve. And as the story goes on, he gradually allows her to see his vulnerabilities, and encourages her to trust him with her own.
And as soon as all the others find out, they're gonna kill me.
I'm not gonna let that happen.
No joke, my favourite scene in the first film is this.
You know why?
Four calmly declares he will not let Triss be discovered, and this leads to him literally letting her inside his head to show her the things he's most scared of. The last of which is that the man who leads her faction of birth, and a close colleague of her parents, was abusive to him as a child.
Your last fear is your worst fear.
I speak from experience. Sharing that kind of information with another person is not easy, and a detail I only caught on my most recent watch. When Marcus goes to strike his son, Triss instinctively tries to protect Four the way he had already protected her.
No!
Outside of that, Four respects Triss's boundaries when she says she doesn't want to go too fast, and sleeps on the floor like a gentleman when she's too afraid to go back to her dorm.
I've already got my spot on the floor.
It also helps that he's not just a bland love interest there to be idealized, but feels like a real person. And Theo James brings a nice edge to the character, while also maintaining that softness.
Now you just want to let me inside of your head?
Are you afraid of that?
They focused on making him realistic rather than dreamy. And considering the joke about Shailene Woodley and her 3 boyfriends, there's not really a competition as to who I ship in the Shaywood multiverse. And in the climax, when Four has been mind-controlled by the serum that didn't originally work on Divergence, what snaps him out of it is...
It's okay.
Yes, this moment is my trash, and I do not care one bit. So it works very well both as a coming-of-age story about identity and a romance, so how about as a dystopia? I usually end up devolving into a quick recap of the supporting cast to tip the hat to each actor who did a good job, but I want to merge this with a comment on the world building as a whole, since as I said ages ago, your supporting cast are part of the world building. And I also want to pivot to this 2-part article written by Lindsay Ellis, written a couple of years after these YA dystopias had their heyday, highlighting how it was a trend in movies set in a post-apocalyptic future to, as she puts it, when civilization falls, if you're a lady, you better gird those loins. It happens a lot in those post-apocalyptic movies, which not coincidentally at all started thanks to cultural anxieties brought on by second-wave feminism, where the mistreatment of women was a frequent set-dressing of these dystopian futures. To the point that Mad Max Fury Road seemed unique for having a film populated by action heroines, and the threats against them were never gendered or sexual. Part 2 of the article also points out that these YA dystopias like The Hunger Games and Divergent avoid this almost altogether, since in the former it's actually Finnick who's said to have been exploited in that way, and Divergent avoids it completely, except for the film replacing Triss's fear of intimacy with this, which is an adaptation criticism I agree with.
Please tell me that you weren't watching that.
Divergent society is actually quite egalitarian if you think about it. 3 out of 5 factions are led by people of colour, and women holding positions of power goes completely unquestioned, since although Janine is the evil erudite leader, Marcus is also an incredibly flawed abnegation leader. We're later introduced to Evelyn, toxic mother, but also effective factionless leader, while in turn no one questions Triss's competency when she takes charge of the rescue mission, or eventual resistance. Her parents invert the usual men are strong, women are smart dynamic that was often present, even within say something like Harry Potter. Natalie was previously part of Dauntless and pulls an action hero rescue, while Andrew was previously part of Erudite. The facilities in Dauntless are also co-ed, and the only joke at a girl's expense is...
You should feel right at home, Candor. Everything out in the open.
And while there are things such as Edward losing an eye as seen in the deleted scenes, there's not a single incident of gendered violence.
Yes, Stiff, take it off. Put it back on.
Males and females likewise train together, including fighting one-to-one, without a single joke about girls being unable to. It's an interesting way to construct a dystopian society without falling into the usual cliches, and arguably this makes the Divergent world more believable as an apparent utopia, where issues such as sexism and racism don't seem to exist, and while to my memory the only same-sex attracted characters are Lynn and Amar, it seems to be the case for homophobia too. And while classism is definitely there, it's reframed to be against the factionless, with the implication that discrimination in this setting is against those who don't live within the system. Abnegation showed charity to the factionless, but no one wants to end up like them. Ashley Ann Haynes writes that the world in Divergent creates an illusion of democracy for participants in its fraction society, with the factions controlled by outside forces. And even with this illusion of equality, there are plenty who still want more, and to oppress the others.
I admire you willing to die for what you believe. But so am I.
I'm actually surprised at just how well developed the entire supporting cast is, without making the movie feel too cluttered, and each actor being really well cast.
Faction before blood. It's an important ideal, but sometimes difficult to fulfill.
Obviously there was a novelty to Kate Winslet of all people being part of such a franchise and playing a villain. At this point, she'd missed out on being part of two major franchises, with an early idea for Return of the King to have her portray Sauron's angelic Maya form, and her agent turning down the role of Helena Ravenclaw in Deathly Hallows on her behalf, much to her annoyance when she found out. She took the role of Janine as a chance to allow her children to see one of her films, joking that her street cred went up as soon as the school friends found out.
It's human nature to keep secrets, lie, to steal. And I want to eradicate that.
While she unfortunately gets a lot of the worst lines, she works with them and definitely seems to be enjoying herself. And also on the villain side, this was my first time seeing Jai Courtney in anything besides Spartacus, so I had no idea about the 2010s backlash he experienced for being in a lot of franchise reboots people didn't like.
Now you're really one of us.
He is very good at giving Eric the right amount of punchable face that makes him an enjoyable villain without being insufferable.
Okay.
Miles Teller may have said the role of Peter made him feel dead inside, but he's an enjoyable douche.
Like, take it easy on you if you cry.
Zoe Kravitz is in the thankless black best friend role, but we love Christina.
Candor, you're not supposed to lie. I was Candor. And I'm not lying.
She has a defined personality, gets some moments to herself, and at least isn't bad representation. Like, considering you can count the Harry Potter characters with plot importance on one hand who aren't white, these YA dystopias felt like one way to actually get decent representation in commercial movies, and at least give young brown actors a chance to launch their careers.
You have to win.
The Hunger Games was against the curve by having a symbol of childhood innocence be a young black girl whose death is what sparks riots. The Maze Runner showed a non-stereotypical Asian American boy as the brave one of the group, as well as an African American as the teen dad. Divergent didn't necessarily give great roles to actors of colour, but at least they were there and they got to do something.
You're exceeding your jurisdiction.
It was at least a step in the right direction, and even watching back what I considered good representation shows we've come a long way in just 10 years. But let's land the plane now. Divergent is remembered in public consciousness either for being a derivative cash-in to ape a very specific trend, or else for its third film being such a box office disaster that the final installment was never adapted. Although admittedly, Allegiant covered so much material that the only thing left to portray in the planned descendant would be, spoilers, Triss's sacrifice. Some go so far as to call it what killed the YA dystopia genre completely, although the final Maze Runner film came out later and still did well. And since I have now made a habit of exhausting hours defending films and TV shows condemned in the court of public opinion that I actually think are quite alright, you can imagine I am quite sad about that.
It's good to know.
Divergent was a franchise that provided lots of comfort and levity during a rather turbulent time in my life, and to this day, the first film remains a good comfort watch for me.
I know exactly who you are.
This isn't just nostalgia talking. I still connect to Triss's journey and find Shailene Woodley's performance full of life. which she brought into the second and third films, attempting to keep the franchise consistent, even with the revolving door of directors deviating even further from Neil Burger's vision. I love the way it's shot. I love the romance. I love the supporting cast. I love these individual scenes so much that I'll probably never get rid of my urge to jump through the door of a moving train. But if Divergent is still the fun thing to mock on the internet, I will gladly take the ridicule. I've been ridiculed most of my life for some very understandable reasons, so I am happy to earn this round.